Recording in progress.
Good evening. This is the Chicago Computer Society Linux SIG meeting for June 2025. Tonight we have, besides the headaches that we ran into with Zoom, others have run into it recently also. If you haven't attended a Zoom meeting with APCUG, they were pulling their hair out also for much the same given reason. And right now it's a case where we have, anyway, the handout will have it. What I came up with is Ubuntu, Fedora, and eventually many others are phasing out X11 officially, being retired probably permanently. Doesn't mean all the problems in Wayland are solved, but if you're relying upon X11, probably by the Linux Mint 22.2, you may not even have the option, or at least the default will be Wayland, and you'll have to manually change to X11. But before too long, X11 won't even be part of the Linux distros. So be aware that this is going on, this kind of a change. Now, I have another one right after this that is very similar, but this will give you some basics of Wayland versus X11. I've been using the X11 quite readily. That's something I didn't think of until just now on that Linux machine. I was running Wayland, and I wonder if I changed to X11 if it would have worked. That's something I'll have to try and check out. At any rate, in addition to this official change of phasing out 11, ain't that nice? This gives you also a guide for newbies, in particular about Hyperland. So it gives you some additional details of how Hyperland is going to work in the new evolving Wayland environment. So you might want to go through that one. God knows what's going to happen next year.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, what I'm going to do is count down 10 common Linux issues and what to do about them. In this video, I'm going to cover all kinds of things from Wi-Fi not working, you're unable to log into SSH, your system's slow. There's going to be all kinds of things on this list that'll be valuable to you guys, and you'll probably run into at least a few of these on my list. Now, with all of that out of the way, it's time to dive in. So let's check out my list of 10 common Linux problems and what to do about them. And the first is what to do when a user is unable to log into a server via SSH. They come to your desk, they tell you that they're trying to access the server via SSH, and they're not able to get in. And what's interesting about this is when you have issues with SSH, it's not always obvious what the underlying problem is. Here's what you do about it. The first thing that I would do is connect to the server via SSH. If you're able to do that, then at least you know that SSH is working in the first place, so you can rule that out at least. But assuming the problem isn't something like that, and that this particular user is the only one that's experiencing a problem, here's what you can do. What I recommend is tailing the authentication logs. Depending on your distribution, this might be in a different file. It could be /var/log/auth.log, for example. It might be varlog secure. Again, it depends on your distribution. Once you know what log file logs SSH failures, then tail that log. Use tail-f and then the path to the log file and the name of the log file, and then tell the user to go ahead and try again. Once they do, you'll see that the log is updating right before your eyes because F is follow mode. You're following the log file, and anything that's newly written to the log will show up on your screen, which also means if the user is trying to log into the server, you'll see the error message in the logs right away. It might say that there's a problem with their SSH key, that they're not in the allowed users list or something, who knows. But whatever it should be made apparent what's going on once you check the log file. My next tip is for those of you that are running Linux on a workstation, a desktop, or a laptop. And it's especially for those of you that use GNOME as your desktop environment of choice. If you haven't changed the desktop environment, chances are you're probably running GNOME. Ubuntu uses GNOME as its default desktop environment. Fedora, the same thing, you get the idea. Now, if your system is running very sluggish, there's one thing that I think people often overlook as the underlying cause: tracker. Now, the word tracker sounds really bad, doesn't it? Who's tracking you? And why are they tracking you? No. I'm not talking about anything like that. The application is named Tracker. That's what I'm referring to. An application or service named Tracker. It's part of the GNOME desktop. What it does is it scans files on your system to allow you to find them faster. It's an indexing service, basically, and it makes all of your searches faster on the GNOME desktop. So it's a good thing to have. But unfortunately, where this often falls down is when you have network shares. For example, let's say you have a big folder full of movies and music and things, and you mount that share to your desktop. Guess what Tracker is going to do? It's going to index everything. And I do mean everything. In my experience, sometimes it's literally indexing the entirety of your NAS, and you'll have no idea that this is happening. So your system just runs slow, and then some people think that GNOME is bloated when that's never been true. It's a very fast and efficient desktop, but sometimes the reason why it's sluggish is literally due to Tracker. But there is a very easy solution for how to deal with this. All you have to do is create a brand new file at the root of your file share. What you'll name this file is .trackerignore, just like you see on the screen right now. If you create this file, even if it's empty, then you'll stop it from scanning that directory. So you should definitely include this in your file shares, for example, unless you do want Tracker to scan those as well. If you have a file share that only has a handful of files, it's not going to take that much time. But if you're like me and you have like 10,000 photos, well, it's going to take a minute, so you'll probably want to disable Tracker and not have this take effect. Anytime Tracker is working on your computer, it's taking a lot of resources away from what you're doing. But the thing is, once Tracker finishes indexing your system, it doesn't really impact performance all that much afterwards. If you save a new file in your home directory, it probably takes it a few seconds to index it. But again, the problem comes when you have a file share or a massive folder with files in it that for some reason it has to scan repeatedly. Again, NFS or Samba shares are a very good example of this. And also, again, it's not going to tell you when it's doing this. So what this will look like is your system is running slow for no apparent reason. Just create that .trackerignore file in the root of your file shares that you don't want indexed and watch how fast your machine happens to be after that point. It's crazy. Now this next problem is very, very strange. It's not strange once you know the root cause of this, but at first it's going to be odd. Imagine that you can't save a file in your home directory or any other file system because it tells you that the disk is full. But when you check, the disk isn't full. You have plenty of hard drive space free. So why on earth is your computer telling you that you're out of space when you're clearly not? Now, in this case, when you run a command like df-h, it's going to show you that you have space free. So that's why people will be confused by this. But try df-i instead. And what that's going to do is show you how many inodes you're using, or how many inodes you have free. The thing is, a Linux installation has a limited number of inodes. Every file or object is going to take up one of these inodes, so that does mean you have a finite number of files you could store on a Linux system. But the thing is, the number of files that you could store on a Linux file system is so crazy high that you'd have to work really, really hard to hit this number. Nobody out there that has a massive movie collection or music collection is going to possibly hit this really large number. It's astronomical compared to how many files you'd have to save on your hard drive to hit this number. But if you do hit this number, it's probably not your fault, at least not directly. It could be an application's fault. Maybe it's creating a file over and over again. If it's restarting over and over again and refreshing its log or creating a new log file over and over again, you should notice that one directory has a ridiculous number of files in it. And this is especially true if you run a mail server. If you have an issue where mail is being caught up and not leaving the server, then the outbox is just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And then at that point, it's going to tell you that your hard drive is full, even though it technically isn't. You just ran out of inodes. Now, the solution to this depends on what the underlying problem is, but the answer is inodes usually. So I wanted to let you know about that, so that way you could file that in your memory banks in case this situation comes up, and I think it will eventually. For the next issue, Wi-Fi isn't working. I can't access Wi-Fi. What should I do? This is really common, and I don't really understand why, because Linux distributions offer live mode. You could use live mode to demo the distribution before you install it. So if Wi-Fi doesn't work, for example, then you shouldn't have installed Linux in the first place and replaced your current operating system, because if it's not working, you shouldn't install it. But it seems like many people don't check this before they install Linux, and they end up with Wi-Fi that doesn't work. And this usually comes down to hardware compatibility. Since drivers are built into the Linux distribution itself, usually you'll have drivers for all the noteworthy Wi-Fi cards out there. Chances are it'll work just fine, except for those of you where it doesn't. And what you should do about this is replace your Wi-Fi card. Seriously. But to be fair, the appropriate answer here that most of you are looking for, or the answer I should give you, is to tell you to find the driver, compile it, and install it, because some Wi-Fi cards just don't contribute upstream to the Linux kernel or distributions, so the distributions have no way of getting that working, or it could be a licensing restriction and you need a driver. You could go and download that driver, but that's not a good idea. Despite what anyone will tell you, anytime you update your Linux distribution, you're going to have to go through this process over and over and over again. And you might forget the process sometime down the road. You might find yourself upgrading a Linux distribution to a newer version just to find Wi-Fi broke again. How did you install the Wi-Fi driver? Oh, right, you don't remember because that was a year ago. Now, sure, you could write down notes, but replacing the Wi-Fi card is always the easiest way to go. If you replace the Wi-Fi card in your laptop, for example, then you'll always be sure you have a supported Wi-Fi card that's known to work with Linux, and then you can just pitch the one that Dell gave you, for example, because it's not compatible with Linux, or put it in a drawer somewhere. You can usually find Intel Wi-Fi cards for less than $15 on eBay. So I don't really understand why so many people out there are trying and trying for weeks on end to get a Wi-Fi card to work, when all they had to do was just pop open the bottom cover, swap the Wi-Fi card, and call it a day. Now, one potential issue you might run into, and it's something you might want to check before you replace the Wi-Fi card, is whether or not your computer manufacturer allows you to. And I'm not just talking about the warranty here. Sometimes a manufacturer might lock the computer, not allow it to boot, if you install a Wi-Fi card that didn't come with it. And that's a really stupid practice that every manufacturer out there should instantly stop doing, because that helps nobody. But it is the case. I've seen this on some HP laptops. I've seen this on some Lenovo laptops. Just understand if yours is one of them. And if it's not, then replacing the Wi-Fi card is literally always the best solution to fix Wi-Fi problems on Linux. Get yourself an Intel Wi-Fi card. You'll generally have no problems whatsoever. If you are still not comfortable opening up your computer to replace the Wi-Fi card, even though it is one of the easier things to replace, you could consider a Wi-Fi card, a USB Wi-Fi card from ThinkPenguin. They're not a sponsor. In fact, I don't think I've ever spoken to them, except to probably order one for myself. So this isn't a sponsored segment or anything like that. But they make Wi-Fi cards that are born to run on Linux. So if you plug in a ThinkPenguin USB Wi-Fi adapter, it's just going to work. And since they're low profile, you can leave it in your computer. It's not going to take up all that much space. So that might be a solution, especially if your manufacturer doesn't allow you to change the one inside the computer. The next common Linux issue that you might run into is when you go to open an application in GNOME, but it doesn't open. So you click on it again, maybe you didn't click on it good enough or something like that, but it still doesn't open. By the third time, you'll probably realize that it's not you that's the problem, it's literally just not opening. And this is really simple to fix, by the way. All you have to do in GNOME, because that's where this happens, is go into Settings, go to your language settings, and make sure that your language settings are set appropriately. I'm going to show some B-roll on the screen right now that's going to show you the process. But when you don't have the locale settings in GNOME set up properly, then the application might be confused, it can't open. But once you set the locale, log out, log in, then applications will open again. This is somewhat common if you hand roll a distribution. Most of the distributions out there that ship with GNOME will already have this taken care of for you. But if you're running something like Arch Linux or one of the other distributions that are more do-it-yourself, you'll be way more likely to run into this. And to save you some time, I just wanted to give you an answer. So all you have to do is go into Settings, set the locale, log out, log in. You're good to go. Next, your games are running very poorly, or maybe you're not even running at all. What gives? And this is one of the things that people run into first when it comes to Linux, especially those of you that have an NVIDIA card, which is who I'm talking about here. Normally, your video card driver is going to be built into your distribution, so you shouldn't have to do anything in order to get your video card up and running. But NVIDIA has a proprietary driver. They don't upstream that to Linux, so there's a bit of a problem here. They kind of silo this, and as a result of this, you have to install the NVIDIA driver yourself manually. But thankfully, most distributions make this pretty easy nowadays. For example, let's take Ubuntu into consideration. Ubuntu has a dedicated application just for drivers. In fact, Linux Mint also has something like this available. You could use this application to scan your system, and if a proprietary driver is available for any piece of hardware, it'll give you an option to install it. And it's pretty easy. You click on it, and then, well, you install it. If you see something here for your NVIDIA card, then that's probably your issue. Since the NVIDIA proprietary driver is not installed by default on most distributions, this is going to be something that you'll have to do after installation. But once you do set up the NVIDIA driver and then reboot, then your game should run just fine. So install your NVIDIA driver because that might be the reason why your games are running so poorly. Now the next one is very, very strange. It's so strange that I can't even explain the problem to you. If your Linux system is behaving erratically, strangely, and you just don't really know what's going on, it could be some random seeming error messages or just some shenanigans going on and you really can't explain it, but it just doesn't seem like it's running all that well. Now, I can't give you an actual symptom here because it differs depending on the hardware, but what I'm talking about are memory issues. If you have defective memory, Linux doesn't handle that well. Actually, no operating system handles that well, but if you have defective memory chips, your computer might run just fine otherwise, but have some strange little quirks going on. You might have defective memory. Now, before anybody says that everything is working fine on Windows and now doesn't work on Linux, then I'm going to stop you right there because that doesn't mean anything. Every operating system handles memory issues differently. The way that you see memory issues in Linux is going to behave differently than Windows and so on. So working in one situation, not working in this one doesn't really mean much. What I recommend you do is run memtest86. It's a free utility, and all you have to do is run it for a few hours just to test your memory on your physical systems. That's what I'm referring to here, your physical systems. And it'll report any errors that you might have. It'll let you know if you have a defective stick of RAM. If you do, there's your problem. You have bad RAM. And for a lot of people, they might have thought that everything was working fine on Windows. Maybe it was fine, maybe it wasn't, or maybe Windows is good at hiding issues. Linux, not so much. But memory issues happen all the time. And especially if you buy a used system, you should run memtest86 on it just to make sure that everything is on the up and up. Number 8, are you dealing with a software problem or a hardware problem? Now, to be fair, hardware issues are usually pretty obvious. For example, if you bump your monitor and crack it, there's a hardware issue. You don't need to do any diagnosing to find out what's going on with your monitor. If there's a big crack in it, you know what's going on. Obviously, it's a hardware issue, but sometimes you don't really know for sure. It could be a software issue or a hardware issue, and here's how you can tell the difference. Run live media. By running a distribution in live mode by downloading the ISO image, creating bootable media, and running off of that, you could find out if your problem persists in that environment or if it only happens in your installed environment. If the problem does not happen on a live instance, for example, then that might mean that you have a configuration issue. You have something to fix in the settings when it comes to your distribution. But if you have the same problem with live media, then you know it's not really related to your installation. There must be something else that's causing it, and now it's starting to look more like there's a hardware issue. Now, it's impossible for me to give you a full list of symptoms here because when it comes to hardware and software problems, that's very generic. I don't know what kinds of hardware problems, what kinds of software problems you might be running into, but what I do know is that live media is something you should always have around. It helps you troubleshoot things, by narrowing down where the problem space is. You can find out if it's an issue with your distribution, maybe something works fine in another distribution, maybe you have a problem that doesn't work regardless of what operating system or distribution you use. In that case, you have a hardware problem, or sometimes you need to get into your system in an emergency basis. Maybe you can't boot the system. In that case, a live media image is going to be great because you could boot the computer even if something failed and maybe get some files off of it before you pitch it. It's a good thing to have live media available, and you always should because it helps you narrow things down. Now it's time for number 9. You should ditch DisplayLink. DisplayLink is a popular technology for USB hubs and docking stations, specifically docking stations, because that's where this comes up the most often. But what exactly is DisplayLink? DisplayLink is technology that powers some of the docking stations out there. And by docking station, I'm referring to the USB-C docking stations or USB 3 docking stations that you might have seen, and maybe you own one. Now the thing is, DisplayLink is very problematic and it has no reason to exist whatsoever. Seriously. DisplayLink, technically, is going to bridge the gap between your operating system and the docking station, allowing things like display and networking and keyboards and whatever else that you have connected to your docking station communicate with your computer to transform your laptop, for example, into a desktop. I mean, that's what a docking station aims to do. But the thing is, operating systems know how to interface with docking stations by themselves. Every operating system, I don't care if it's Windows, Mac OS, and yes, Linux, they have 100% support for these docking stations. It's built right into the operating system. And when it comes to Linux, you don't have to install anything. If you have a standard USB-C docking station, you have to install nothing. Windows, nothing. Nothing to install there, nothing to install on Mac OS. A true docking station, you plug it in, you're done. The minute you have to install something to get it working, well, there's a problem because you should never have to do that. And because of DisplayLink existing and being such an unnecessary technology, it causes all kinds of problems. For example, when it comes to Linux, it does support Linux, so yes, you can get these to work on Linux, but only very specific distributions. And when you update your system, your docking station might just stop working. And the reason for this is because the DisplayLink driver is required in order to allow this to work with your device, which is interesting because when it comes to docking stations, on any operating system, like I mentioned, no driver is required at all. You don't have to install anything. It makes things more complicated. Just get a standard USB-C docking station and you won't have any problem. Now for the last one on my list, we're going to talk about hardware compatibility. More specifically, we're going to talk about what to do when your hardware doesn't seem that compatible. Maybe you try a Linux distribution and your network card, video card, or some other device just doesn't work. Now, it could be the case that you have a distribution that's not compatible with your hardware, but more often than not, the problem is that you're using too old of a Linux kernel. Seriously. Because of the fact that the Linux kernel has most of the drivers that Linux needs built right in, if you're using an older kernel, then your older kernel can't possibly understand new hardware that came out after the kernel did. So imagine if you have a motherboard that came out, yesterday, and you're using a Linux kernel from a year ago. That Linux kernel has no way of knowing that hardware was going to be created in the future, so it's not going to work with it. Now, the biggest problem here is that most likely you didn't choose which Linux kernel you're using. That was chosen for you by the distribution. And some distributions, they ship with an older kernel. So what you'll want to do if you're having hardware compatibility issues is just understand how new your hardware is and how old your Linux kernel is. Now, you might not know what constitutes a new Linux kernel and an old one. One metric is when your distribution came out. If you're using a distribution that came out a few years ago, well, the kernel probably did too. And two distributions you can consider checking out that might help you in this case is Ubuntu or Pop! OS. Both of them have really good compatibility with hardware, so if you're using a different distribution, you could consider one of those. But more often than not, if you're using an older Linux kernel, then you might have some hardware compatibility issues to diagnose. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this list of common Linux issues and their...
Okay. I brought this one in part because I had a Ubuntu Cinnamon laptop with a 24.10 version, and it would not upgrade even though there was one available for a version 25.04, and kept going around the block. And I'm going to put into hope a AI troubleshooting session I went through, and with it I can take and show you. I gotta stop sharing there. And through this, I'm going to go to the chat. Now in the chat, if you look, you got an AI troubleshooting session I went through with AI before I finally found out what the problem was. It turned out that there was corruption in one library entry in the Ubuntu. It can happen in any distro of Linux, but in Windows, we have tools that would probably detect this problem and possibly repair it easily. What I had to do was, once I learned that that was the likely cause of the problem, was I had to do a removal of that module because it was blocking an update available, and then do a clean install of that library entry, and problem got solved. I upgraded to 2504 without a hitch. Now, between the video and what I'm sharing there with the AI, does anybody have any questions? No issues? Like I said, no issues.
Question.
Go ahead.
On my Linux box, I see I don't have the latest Zoom on there. So I went to zoomus.us download.
Okay.
And it brings up, it seems to know I'm on Linux.
It knows you're on Linux, yes.
It says, please select a Linux type.
Right.
So I see Mint, but I think the thing that throws me a little bit is the one on my box would be Ubuntu or Debian.
You gotta
Linux.
stop there. Anything that's based upon the Debian OS gets a .db, a DEB extension. Anything. That means for Ubuntu, Mint, Robo Linux, MX Linux, Zorin OS, etc., etc. They're all use DEB. That's it.
Okay.
And if you were to get on Fedora, OpenSUSE, Gecko, to name a couple, they would have .rmp. And then you have the Arch base, they are ARCH. It doesn't matter which the distribution is. If you're based upon one of those three classes of Linux, that's what the extension is for all of them.
Okay, so I would just pick the Mint drop down, the Mint selection in the drop down.
Right. Even
though they have a separate Ubuntu and Debian choice, I want to pick the Mint.
Well, the Debian is there for somebody who has Debian installed. If you have Ubuntu, like the Ubuntu Cinnamon I have installed on another machine, I could select the Ubuntu. There is nothing to say that they might not do a little tweaking on the distros if they know of a problem. So generally speaking, you want the Debian version of the basic update, but your distro may tweak it a little bit more because of problems they discovered in their distro.
Okay. So the one on my machine that you had put on would be what? The Ubuntu or the Debian?
Do you have Debian on your system? Do you have
Well, I don't
Debian?
know. I don't know which version of Mint I have, the
It
Ubuntu or
don't
the
matter.
Debian.
No. Debian is its own OS. Ubuntu is its own OS. Mint is its own OS. Zorn, MX, Robo Linux, etc., they're all their own distinctive OS.
Okay.
Period.
Okay. So if I pick the Mint and it wants to know if I want, 64-bit, which I guess I do, and then there's a download button.
Right.
So my other question is, underneath the download button, they say Zoom's RPM packages are signed with a GPG key. Please run RPM import package signing -key.pub to import the key in case package management utility asks for a missing public key.
That will only happen in Fedora and other RPM distributions. It's
Okay.
not relevant to the dead package.
And we just told you have nothing but a DEB. Period.
Right. But like I said,
If
I
it says,
recognized that I had Linux, so I didn't know why it put
Yeah.
that on the
because
screen here for Linux.
they download to everything.
Okay.
Yeah, but
They're not exclusive to you. They are not exclusive to Bob or Drew. They are generic. So they
Okay.
make
Yeah.
distributions for every one of the three main families of distributions, period.
Okay.
If it
Yeah.
says RPM in that note, ignore it. If it
Okay.
says Arch, ignore it. If it
Okay.
says DEB, that's a different story.
Okay. Once I hit download, it'll put it on my machine, and I guess I have to launch it.
Right click on the deb package. At the very top should be install using the software installer. And it'll have a little box that looks like a package as its icon. Right up there at the top of the right click menu.
It'll say install using a what?
Using the
install.
software install,
Oh, the software install.
which is Mint's way of installing things.
Okay.
It's
So it'll
easy.
prompt me for probably the password like the regular menu.
Yeah, well, what it does is it pops up a little box that asks you whether you want to install. You hit the install button, then it asks for your password.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
Don't worry
And
about
then
it.
if you want to see the details, you can click on details and watch all kinds of stuff go down the screen.
Okay.
It's just a case where right now, don't update it.
Yeah, some people are having difficulties if you
Okay.
upgrade.
So I'll just put it off.
Like me.
Personally, I didn't, but maybe I got lucky.
Yeah, and I did, and so other people are. So it's 6.5.1. Hold off to 6.5.2.
Okay. Got it.
Now,
I wish they would. I wish they would offer older versions like 6.5.0, which did not have the issue.
Yeah, but be careful now. I already upgraded to 5.1. I have my old one still in the system. They will not install. They won't allow you to downgrade.
if you do a purge, if you
That-
do a purge
I
on
would
it,
have to do a
then they would.
purge while I'm trying to get the system up and going for the meeting.
You don't
And-
want to do it while you're getting
well,
up
that's
and
what I'm
going.
getting at. And once the purge is done, and that's what I had to do in that AI article I just put in the chat. I purged it. I then had to do an install, and I redid an install. Only in this case, like for you, Dennis, and like me, down in your folder for exploring your files, in the download folder, you'll probably find multiple versions of Zoom in there, and you could
Yeah.
select the prior one. Mine says right now, I have the June driver. That's what they called it. And the older one next in line is a May one. If I did a double click on that May one, it would launch the installer like Bob described. It'll bring up a box. In the upper right hand corner is an install button. You click the button, it would install that version. But it can't do it while a newer version's installed.
And perhaps, Tim, we ought to make clear what we mean, that there's a difference between remove versus purge.
Yeah, it's one of these things where a purge pulls out more than a remove does. A remove does a basic package removal. I liken it to the Windows system in that if you use the built-in Windows management program for programs to uninstall the application, you get a basic removal. But most of the applications you would remove leave a ton of garbage in the registry. They leave a ton of garbage files that have no purpose or use. The purge will take even that stuff out, except that Linux never has had, and I pray to God they don't have a registry.
In Linux, these are called configuration files
Right.
or config files, and they don't automatically get removed by the remove command.
Right. But I was replacing something, and sometimes that removal might show that when I went to reinstall, it wasn't going to go. In which case, then I'd have to do a purge, is what Bob's getting to.
Yeah.
And that would have removed everything about that bad package that was corrupted. Then the install would have put everything back in place and up to date.
Yeah. And sometimes you need to go as far as using BleachBit before you try to reinstall something.
Yeah. I use BleachBit quite a bit, but now on Windows, you only get one entry. But guess what? It'll always come up asking for the administrator's password if I'm in my standard account.
Yep.
And that will remove certain things from a Windows operating system. In most, but not all Linux distributions, you have a separate blank one and one that says add root. And the root does the equivalent on Windows where you put in your master password. However, if you run it again and say no, it still runs, but that's in the user's account that it's doing its purging of garbage. And that's what the second one is. So if you see a Linux distro that has only one entry like Windows, you have to run it two ways to really clean your system.
Yeah, Linux has fairly strict separation of accounts.
Right. Except in one version of Linux that I've got that I've been pulling my hair out on, that they don't, they're partitioning, multi-partitioning like I do, and you do, and most everybody else here does. That is not functioning, and right now you can only do the goose egg installation and it does work.
Yeah, the Calamares installer by default has a problem with that, and you have to go through all kinds of hoops to change it. But in Mint, we're clear of that.
Yeah, well, but you might run into the same kind of problem in other distros. That's the problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, one thing I want to mention before I continue, I almost forgot about it because of the way things have started off, and I've got to edit the video anyhow. West Side would normally be on July the 3rd. That's always canceled by Sanford because of the proximity of the holiday, and a lot of people are doing anything and everything except sitting at their computer. So that gets canceled. The next meeting will be Tips and Tricks SIG on July the 8th. And then we have normal schedule until we get into like possibly November and December. Definitely in December. All right, now let's see how many more hairs on my head I can lose. All right, we're gonna move on. Now here's an announcement. KDE Plasma 6.3.5 set to debut in Debian 13. There's a little gotcha though. The current current version of KDE just got released is 6.4. But if you want the 6.4, you may have to manually install it on your system. So this is something that's coming up, and Bob has mentioned to us previously that Debian is a version of the Mint Cinnamon desktop will change to from 6 to 7 anywhere in the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, and that will also be Debian 13.
Yeah. But 13, I don't think it told me when it was the actual date.
13's out, but
yeah, it is out. Yeah, May 17th they released it. So right now they're working on Mint LMDE 7 to get the bugs out of it and eventually release it.
And also Mint 22.2 will be coming out close to that time.
Yeah.
And it will have an upgrade.
Usually they at most separate by about a month.
Okay.
It could be almost the same day, but I have seen before where maybe they had a delay 1 month versus the other.
Right. I talked over somebody else. Somebody else had something.
That was me. I just wanted to tell you that I've been running KDE Plasma 6.4 for a few days.
Okay.
It's absolutely gorgeous.
Well, it depends upon now Debian. Understand, Earl. Debian is a ultra conservative.
Yeah, and KDE Neon, which I'm running, is bleeding edge.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about bleeding edge per se, seriously, but it is more advanced. That also means the possibility of bugs that you may never find in Debian. Usually, if you have a problem in Debian, it's because it's you've got something newer than it knows how to handle.
If I'm not mistaken, 6.4.1 should be out tomorrow. You know, another point release.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
At least in beta.
But see, that's the thing. When you say Neon Plasma is bleeding edge, you have to try Arch if you want bleeding edge.
Well, I used it
Maybe,
because
but if
YouTube
you,
video people
hey,
say that about Neon.
I'll tell you right now that Arch is the distro of bleeding edge technology. It is something could have been released 30 minutes ago, and you already got an update for your Arch to install because they don't
Well,
check it out.
yeah, I'm not sure I want to go that far, but in
Well,
general,
that's why I'm saying you're not bleeding edge. You're more advanced than Debian, but all the distros in the Debian family are generally more advanced than Debian is. Debian is the grandmother of the whole Debian series of distros,
and that's why a lot of
and they
people,
are very conservative in checking out every single little tiny detail before they bless it and put it into the open updates. Otherwise,
which does lead to some issues with software compatibility and needing drivers that aren't possible.
yeah, and that is a real problem. It can be a problem with LMDE because it's based right on top of a real Debian operating system with the look and feel of Linux Mint and a lot of its tailoring, but they are not overriding the base Debian. Now, when you get into Ubuntu, you get into Mint, you get into Neon Plasma, etc., the developers, they don't check everything out that changes, at least not to the degree that the Debian team does. And the end result is you could experience some strange problems occurring after an update that other people are not experiencing.
let me just mention too, your earlier discussion on X11 being deprecated or whatever.
Yes.
But of course, Wayland has X Wayland, and all the announcements that I've seen on this topic point out that most applications or X11 applications work pretty darn well under X Wayland. So even if they drop
That's
X11 standard,
You're
you
correct. You're
run
correct on that. X-Wayland is a subsection of code to the Wayland video compositor
yeah.
that creates your display screen, what you're looking at. And
Okay.
the X-Wayland at some point in time in the future is also going to disappear. And it'll be pure Wayland.
In Fedora, they are already dropping X Wayland.
Yeah, and that's what I'm getting at, what I'm trying to get at. What you're looking at there is a temporary fix to make Wayland more compatible with the older programs and applications, etc., that are relying upon X11 still. But
Yeah.
at the same time, it's a temporary fix. That's all it is. It's a bridge. Now, if you really want something cutting edge, look into Hyperland. Hyperland is a add-on to the Waylands to give you even better video than what you think you're getting right now with KDE 4.0. I'm not joking, because it really enhances things. It also gives you the ability to tile windows, which X11 doesn't handle, and Wayland, I'm not sure if it even handles it. It probably doesn't do it very well.
I don't know.
But check into HYPRLAND if you want to check out what's coming down the pike, even for Neon Plasma. I'm going to move on to the next thing. Arch Linux shifts to pure WoW 64 builds for wine and wine staging. I'll let you guys read this. I got a little confused exactly what they were attempting to do here. But if I read it right, it almost sounds like they're stealing a copy of the WoW 64 library in Windows to be able to handle more programs and handle them all better than what it has to date. So it's kind of a way of getting around supporting in Linux Windows programs to be able to run natively, as I understood it. And I may have made a mistake in understanding it because it was causing me some confusion. But it's at least something that is a major step in the wine area trying to support Windows programs on a Linux system. The best system is to have a machine that's got enough cores, memory, and storage where you can set up a virtual machine of a Windows 10 or a Windows 11 machine, install your programs that you want and need in there, put copies of your data files in that machine, and run from Linux as the host your Windows stuff in a separate window, which you could open up in one of the virtual desktops of your Linux system. So you could have on desktop 1 your host's Linux system of choice, and then in a window 2 could be Windows 10, and Windows 3, if you got enough horsepower in your system, you can have Windows 11 running if you wanted to. And in 4, you could have another different distro of Linux running. Those are 4 is usually what the default is in Linux. You can in Windows you have 1, but you can add more, and Linux allows you to add more. But as you add more virtual desktops, it takes up more and more of your memory, and it taxes your CPU. This is also another area that'll tax your GPU if you don't have a dedicated GPU. So there's ups and downs with everything, but it gives you, especially if you know anybody who is on Windows 10 and they don't seem to be getting off the dime in going to 11, to Linux, to Chromebooks, etc. They could look at a Linux distro, but they're going to need a machine that has at least 4 cores. I would say 16 gigs of memory. And if you currently have a drive in your system that's a spinning hard drive, you got to change to a solid state. And you want one that's probably more than twice as large as what your current spinning hard drive is. And the reason for that is you're going to have a need to install a virtual machine like VirtualBox. There's also a free version of VMware, and on a Linux box, if you want to experiment, that means that you would use either bottles. No, wait a minute, not bottles. Pardon me. One of them is oh, I can't think of it right now. My mind's been scrambled tonight. There's 2 virtual machines. QEMU is one, and the other one is a better front end on top of QEMU. And it's I mentioned this once more than a year ago. So it's doable there. You get the virtual machine. It doesn't cost you anything. You just have to have the horsepower and go through tutorial videos or articles on how to properly set up what you're trying to set up, and then install the OS you want to put in the virtual machine, whether it's Linux, Windows. Sometimes you can get Mac OS to work too, but you might run into a few problems there. But there's lots of documents out there that will help you resolve those issues.
And two of the programs are VirtualBox and Proxmox.
No,
For running virtual machines.
well, that Proxmox is another one, but there's another one besides the two you mentioned. There's a third one because I remember coming across it, like I say, more than a year ago.
You mentioned QEMU.
Yes, I did that because that is the base foundation. The other one's based upon. It's a graphical interface. QEMU, if I remember right,
Yep.
is primarily a command line based system, and this other is a graphical user interface in front of it, so that you can do it from a Windows, not a terminal.
KVM.
It might be KVM.
And also there's XEN.
Okay, I didn't know that one. But Proxmox, that's way above most of our pay scales. I probably can handle them. I would think Drew can handle it. It's just a case where it can be very taxing on a computer that doesn't have enough resources. So the other two are easier to do in taxation of the system. It's better to use the KVM or the XVM or whatever you call it.
Yeah. XEN. Yeah, there's also VMware. It's available, but it's not free.
No, there is a free version, but I don't know if it works on. There is only one. I think it's an enterprise class version that is free in VMware, but I don't know if it is usable on a non-Windows system, such as Linux.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine that's running the free version of VMware on Linux.
Okay. So that's an option too. It's just a case where in some instances you may run into some issues, at least with the QEMU and KVM and XVM. Those are pretty much native to a Linux environment. Proxmox does a very good job from what I understand, but at the same time too, you got to have quite a bit more because that's a server class system.
Yeah. The other one that's said to be simple is GNOME boxes.
Haven't heard that one either, but I stay away from GNOME.
Yeah.
I don't particularly care for GNOME.
That may just be a name for it.
Could be. All right, I'm going to try and move on a little bit here. Mint 20 is dead. Long live 20. If anybody's still sitting back on version 20, they're up to crick because they're not getting any updates anymore. And the only option is to upgrade to at least 21, and why you wouldn't go to 22 beats the heck out of me. So that's another little gotcha that some people just are adverse to doing some of the upgrades because sometimes they run into headaches that they don't know how to handle. And I think that's where my mentioning the use of AI to help you out comes in. AI can be a headache in the sense that you got to be careful how you word things. You got to give it enough information. And if you look at that AI report that I gave you, it gives you an idea that I am giving it feedback as to what did happen that I tried out and stuff like that. That feedback helps it narrow down the problems and where to go next. I use Copilot, and Copilot defaults to a quick answer, give you the fastest answer it can. And it's not the best when you're dealing with computer problems. You can click the little down arrow next to quick and select deep think. Deep think gives me all those answers. So it's something to keep in mind. I've also used Gemini. Gemini works good. I haven't gotten around to using Claude, and I haven't used can't think of the name of it now. There's another A.
Perplexity.
Perplexity. Thank you, Drew. Yeah, I haven't gotten around to that. I don't have enough hours. I got to stop sleeping. Another thing that you should be aware of is a firmware update updater is available, and its primary purpose seems to be only for an HP portable USB-C hub. And I didn't go deep into it as a result, since I don't have one. But generally speaking, if you got a HP USB hub, then you may want to try and get a hold of the latest firmware updater. It may deal with some issues that hub is having otherwise. It says
There is other hardware that can benefit from this.
that could be true. It depends upon exactly what it's doing versus its predecessor. See, there's a 2.0 series, and this one is a release of 2.0.11, and there's a 12 release, adds support for the portable USB hub. So you have to read through this and try and determine what it's going to be like. Also, I2C dev kernel. I2C is a Linux desktop version that I've never seen myself, but I do know of it from other articles and stuff. So that's something some of you might want to peruse through. Sway. It's giving Sway 1.11 is going to give Wayland tiling compositor add-on support, and hopefully at some point in time that goes from an add-on to being integrated into Wayland, along with possibly Hyperland. Ooh. Okay. Now, looks like they something may be blocking this. The original article was CISA warns of attackers exploiting Linux flaw with POC exploit. So if you can bring it up off the list that I gave you in the handout, you'll be able to get the details, or you can try and find the article yourself. Here's another one. New Puma botnet brute forces SSH credentials to breach devices. So I have two little servers that I have neglected for several months because I haven't had enough time to mess with them. I do SSH into them, but right now, if I lose them, I lose them. I'm not going to be that concerned because there's no information on there for them to glean. But if I detect that they broke in, well, I can always turn the things off by pulling the plug. Because I haven't had enough time to mess with them right now. I gotta get back to them, but I don't know when that's going to be. Now here's one here, Windows 11 and the Red Hat Linux hacked on the first day upon to own. That doesn't bode well for either one of them because Red Hat tends to be an enterprise level business class system, highly touted, and Windows 11 is supposed to be heavily secure. Well. So we got at least a couple of things that have holes in them that somebody's going to have to do some masonry work on. New Tor Onux tool anonymizes any Linux app network traffic. And I didn't have time to get into this. It sounds interesting offhand. There is the Tor browser. Usually they make their own USB stick and have Tor browser on the stick, and you run your Tor browsing session running from the stick, no matter what you have loaded on your system. So you have to boot into it. It's a live only distro on a USB stick. And Tor browser, it uses what's called the onion method of trying to lose trackers by switching frequently between various servers, mostly through Europe. But it is considered still pretty secure, but some times some of the state-sponsored, like RussiaNet, might have a way of being able to get some of the information, such as the beginning point and the end point, and some of the information might be decrypted. So that's this may be an answer to it. I don't know. This piece of software, I gotta get into reading it more. Microsoft fixes a Linux boot issue on dual boot Windows systems. Well, at least they're fixing something on Windows. I don't recommend a single drive dual boot system. A dual drive dual boot system is okay. And the reason is Microsoft doesn't play nicely normally on Linux. Maybe some developers that use the Windows WSL subsystem are complaining about this issue here on a single drive. That's a speculation on my part.
Actually, it's a dual boot issue, and it has to do with the secure boot blacklist, and it was fixed back in March. The problem is the blacklist blacklisted a shim, as we call it in Linux,
Okay.
which allows Linux to work under secure boot. You're not supposed to have secure boot going if you're going to dual boot with Linux and all kinds of other things. But the upshot is that the shim has been updated in many distros and many tools.
Yeah, well, I still have come across at least one that gives me a headache if I have secure boot on.
Yeah. But Ventoy, for example, has been fixed.
Let's see. Huh, I actually got it in here twice by accident.
Well, it's important. It's both Linux and Windows.
Well, I have to make this list manually. Linux IO Uring security blind spot allows stealthy rootkit attacks. This one we all got to pay attention to because of the possibility of getting a rootkit put on our system. And rootkits are usually very good at staying hidden on systems unless you're running good security software scans periodically that check for rootkits. And at the moment, even I'm at a loss as to what to run on a Linux system to check for a rootkit. So that's something we got to be thinking and trying to act upon positively as soon as we can. Microsoft uses AI to find flaws in Grub 2, U-Boot, Bearbox, and bootloaders. Well, another one in their cap. I wish they would focus on the all the problems that Microsoft Windows has, as they are on finding problems in some of the Linux stuff. Ubuntu Linux security bypasses require minimal mitigation. So this is another way of bad guys trying to get into your system by bypassing things and getting into your system. Another one here is Auto Color Linux has a backdoor apparently targeting North American governments and universities. Well, you got to stop and think here a second, folks. Now, with governments, that's one thing, but universities are one of the repositories for Linux distributions that most of us download. So there's a high probability that there are a lot of people running a Linux distro that comes from a university, and they may be having a problem here that creates a backdoor which allows some of those distros possibly to be doctored, even though it's difficult to do. Don't know. Lots of good news going on. Security warning. Over 1.8 billion Gmail users implemented these critical security steps now. Big deal. AT&T's announcement of over 16 billion account information probably puts most everybody, at least in the United States, out there on the black web for anybody who pays for some of that information to be able to get personal information and do a whole lot of nasty stuff, including your accounts that you visit online, such as a pharmacy or Social Security or something like that. You may have a surprise coming. This browser, this is one I gotta check into. I have looked at this a few times over the last several years and haven't really liked it, but it touts itself as a browser built for people who never close tabs, like me. When you're talking hundreds to well over up to 1,400 tabs I may have open at one time in one browser across multiple windows, maybe as many as a dozen or so windows. That's a lot of stuff that's taxing the system, except I have tools that Chrome is trying to get rid of. And I found out on the two Chromebooks my brother passed on to me, I can no longer install one of those tools, and they're constantly nagging me to try and get me to they shut off some more, up to 2/3 of my normal extensions to the browsers, and they want you to remove them from your system, or at least from that browser. And it's a case where they're not following supposedly Google's standard for proper I guess coding of their application extension. And as an end result, they're getting blacklisted by Chrome and Google. It also affects Chromium on some of them, not to the extent of Chrome, however. And that means any other browser like Vivaldi here and Brave is another one. Edge is another one. They're all based on Chromium. At some point in time, those may start showing up, trying to turn off extensions you want to use in your browser, because they give your browser more capability and functionality or security than just the baseline browser itself. And that's really ticking me off. With Chromebooks, you cannot change the browser, at least not easily. I remember years back I could load in a Firefox browser, but it didn't work as well as Chrome did. It's, after all, their baby, so they make it work as best as possible. But if you don't have the tools you need to do the work you do, that's a big issue. I can understand a warning, but when they actually turn it off and pop up a box that says, hey, the blue button is remove these items from my browser. And that the only other option is a white button to manage your extension. You go in, you can turn them back on, but every one you turn back on, you have to confirm you want to turn it back on. And that's a royal pain in the butt when you're talking quite a few different extensions. So I don't know if they're truly being truthful about what's going on about this. I've had some years ago that Google did the same thing, but it was minute compared to what it is right now. And I was only talking like one or two extensions. Well, now I have at least 6 to 8 extensions, and if I take them all out, I haven't got a whole lot left, a reason to use that browser. So I'll try and find alternatives that are not as stringent on what's going on, because I've used these extensions for a decade or more, and I'm quite happy with them. Google apparently is not, for their own reasons, with the extensions, and they're entitled to it. Chromium are their babies to start with. Even if Chromium is open source, Chrome is not. And if they say they don't want these extensions in your browser, on your system, I guess in a certain sense they have the right to say turn them off, and if you're smart, you remove them. Maybe I'm not smart enough continuing to use them until I am convinced they are a bad thing, in which case then I can consider the option of removing. But Vivaldi is an old one that goes back. It was a fork off opera, if I remember right. The original head guy of opera, when opera went into a certain direction with the opera browser, he quit and started up his own company and created the Vivaldi browser, is what I can remember. So anybody got any other questions so far? Gee,
So that Vivaldi browser would run on the Linux machine.
yeah. Almost all the browsers, I can't think of too many browsers that would be out there that will not run on Windows, Mac, and Linux.
So if I installed it, I guess I want to know if, like right now I'm on Firefox on Linux, but if I got the Vivaldi, I could like maybe open 50, 60, 80 tabs open and then just use that when I want to go into those tabs. But if I want to use just a Zoom meeting or my mail, I could just go into Firefox.
Potentially, yes, but here's the other thing. You've got to make sure that you set up any browser that allows lots of tabs, which almost all of them, including Firefox, will do. That either the browser is set to put the tabs you're not looking at right now to sleep. That means you still have the tab, you have the title in the tab, and you have the URL, but all the content has been purged from your system. When you click on the tab, it reloads the current version of the web page content. That's
Okay.
what happens. If you don't do that, I couldn't open up, we're talking 800 to 1400 tabs in my system, because to begin with, your browser, whatever you, any program you got running besides the operating system, is running other memory usage. So if you had Firefox open and Vivaldi open, they each take a certain amount of space in your memory, and there's no way around that. Then every single tab in each of those two browsers that are not asleep but are awake, they take a certain amount of memory, and it varies based upon each individual web page as to how much space
Okay.
that page occupies. So if I
Okay.
got 5 tabs open in 2 of the browsers, I've got a lot of memory now alive with stuff that's taking up a lot of space. Depending on how much RAM you have in your system, it's going to be very easy to run out of space. With them asleep, they take up next to nothing in the way of space, but your browser still is there. It has to have its main body in the memory alive at all times. But if you only open up one tab at a time to do something with, and then you put it to sleep, and that's where one of my key tools comes in. It puts things to sleep when I want them put to sleep, not on some timer. Now, there is a timer to it. If I were to get up and say go fix a meal and eat the meal, by the time I come back, all the open tabs except for the current one I have open may have gone to sleep.
Okay.
But that's on a timer, and I move faster than the timer does. So the end result is I have to have the ability to put my tabs to sleep when I need them put to sleep. Firefox has a tool there too. It's not as good, but it beats nothing. Okay, anybody got any thing else that they want to discuss? I've got the handouts yet. I've got an extra one too. Let's see here. Oh, shoot, I keep doing it in the wrong sequence. Okay. This one I haven't gotten deep into. I did some research, and I'm going to give it to you guys, and maybe one of you guys can even report to the rest of us on it. This is Linux tools to try and detect problems and maybe fix them. And here's my list of articles. I don't know what the problem is with that first video. That's from APCUG. It says so. It leads off with changes to Zoom for chat, which I'm not noticing right now myself, and it may be in part with a setting that APCG set up in their system that I have not set up in CCS's system. That I've got to yet research, but I haven't had time for that either. So the rest of it, the majority of that video is the Linux presentation. Basically, it's for people who are on Windows 10 that aren't getting off the dime at the moment. They don't know what they're going to do. And he's trying to give a very simplistic newbie version of playing with Linux. And I know of another guy that's in another group that he wants to run his Linux system, Mint, is strictly in graphical mode, if at all possible, and he's only had a few times here and there that he's gone to the command line, and he doesn't want to mess with the command line unless absolutely necessary. I think he's missing out on some power and capabilities. He is apparently, from what I'm seeing, like myself, using AI client to take and do diagnostics and try and have the AI help him either find a problem and correct it, or to how do I do something. What he has been posting of late is creating a shortcut desktop to shut down the computer or reboot the computer. And I already have tools in Windows that'll do the same thing, and I never use that feature because basically, if your system is having serious problems, those two features may not even work. So I've never put shut down the system or reboot the system from there. It's too easy to go to the start button, hit the power button and say, oh, I want to restart or I want to shut down. Why he wants the desktop shortcuts, I don't know. Doesn't make good sense to me. But I do have on my Linux box, as you should have seen in the past, some shortcuts, but they have nothing to do with doing a reboot or a shutdown. They're added function, such as increasing the size of text only to a specified amount, and then being able to reset the text to normal. And that helps being able to give readability, and it's for Linux. I have two others. One is does a sandboxing of the Chromium browser, unless you have a snap version that's like in Ubuntu. Chromium in most of the other distros is a direct install and has no sandboxing capability. Anything that's in flat pack and snap packs are sandboxed. So that helps them tremendously in trying to keep some of the bad stuff somebody may be trying to download into your system from a website you are visiting. Another one that I have is for only low-end computers that I have that are old Windows 10 systems that aren't going to be upgraded to anything but Linux anyhow. Some of them have very, very slow clock speeds for idling the computer when it's not busy. And it makes it very, very slow to get up to speed when you want to do some work. And what it does is it's not an overclocking program. It allows you, though, to change that low idle clock speed to a higher reasonable speed, and it will eat up on a laptop battery faster than the battery software thinks it should. But that's a small price to pay to give you better response in the system. So anybody got anything else? If not, I've got a
Yes.
no.
A question regarding file management. So I've got a number of users on this Linux box, and I would like to create a file folder location on the box that they all can share.
You broke up a little bit. Are you saying you got
Okay.
a bunch of users on there, which they have their own login and own desktop, and you want a common share area?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, there is. In that first video, he even alluded to it that I played. The guy that has the 10 common problems, one of those is about the share area and things you don't want to have running. And he had a tool there that did indexing, and it will index the share areas unless you put in this line as the first line in your directory of shared information. So there are share folders available in Linux. I've never set one up, so I can't give you details. Has anybody else set up share folders in Linux? Well,
They're basically a network share resource, and you usually do have a server involved, which probably is going to be hosting the shared directories. But you can share directories in a way that's a little different from Windows, but it's pretty straightforward. It may use Samba. That's one way.
So if I attach a USB drive to the machine rather than doing a server,
All
and
right.
mount it and put the folder in there, then can I actually share that out to all the users so they can all access it?
Yes, you can set
computers?
permissions. Hold on.
Drew, while you were out,
Drew, start over.
He's teaching Androids to school students after school, and he's got Linux,
Arduino.
Arduinos.
He's got a system set up with Linux with a user account for each of the students. And what he wants is a common share area in the Linux
Right.
without using a server.
Well, what about turning on SSH server and then what I would do is, to keep it simple, create a new user account, call it, Jake or Janice or whatever you want to call it. and give all of the other users access to that user account so that they're isolated into that home folder.
Right.
They can't go anywhere on the system other than in that home folder. But the home folder is as big as you want it to be. And then let people connect up to it using SFTP.
Oh, okay, so now here's the key here. First of all, it's not at the school. So it's not what Tim said. This is on my home box where I've got mirrors of some of the stuff at the school. So I've got 3 users on the box that I'm currently talking onto. One is the private one that I'm using here to connect to the internet for Zoom and stuff like that. And then one is my username attached to the school for those files. And then I've got one where it's just a garbage account. But I'd like to be able to add files to a folder attached to this box, just to this box, where all 3 of the users that are on this box can see it.
Right.
So I'm thinking a USB attached drive to the box with folder on it, and then folder out to the 3 users on the box.
Well, if those 3 people are not physically using that same piece of hardware, they're on their own computers.
No, they're all using this piece of hardware. Just at different times.
Just at different times of the day.
Or different times of the week.
Yeah.
So I typically shut the machine down after each one of the users, because it's by task rather than by actual user. So after this meeting is over, I will shut the machine off to go to a different user right away if I want to. But the USB drive can stay attached.
Right.
I would say at the moment, the best thing to do is do a search for Linux share folders. That's probably what you're wanting, and you have to specify each of the users that has access to that folder.
Yeah. So you create the new folder, and then you might want to create a group and give that group write permission to the folder or the drive, and then add the users to the group.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's probably the quickest way I can think of, and it beats using the USB stick.
So I'm thinking the USB drive, not the stick, only because I've only got like a 500 gig drive on the box. And some of the files are video files.
Right.
So I want to get them off the box and I don't have room in this box to put another hard drive in it, because it's an all-in-one platform.
He's using a AIO system.
So setting up a NAS is not really an option here.
Not really. Not for 3 users and
Okay, single
Well,
drive.
Be attached to it. A USB single drive attached to it is okay.
And then what you would do is designate that drive as being a network resource.
Okay.
And then you could apply permissions.
Okay.
As a network resource, you can certainly mess with the permissions.
I don't know if this was
Yeah,
already. I don't know if this was already mentioned, but I was trying to do a search, and AI was saying to share a folder between users on the same Linux computer, create a new group, and add the users to that group.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's the
Yeah.
norm. That's the norm. And you would just do the permission changes, usually to a folder that
Yeah.
is on the system, uh, and that gives them permission then to do either a read-only or a read-write capability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I
It could
did
be
it
a
here,
it could be a network resource or a local resource.
yeah.
Right.
It even gives a step-by-step guide to do that. It gives sudo commands, shows the
Yeah.
sudo commands
Put the
for all that.
URL in a chat.
Yeah. Put the reference in chat. Can you, Dennis?
Well, I put in a search in Google and it came up with an AI overview. I don't know if there's a direct link to that. Let me try this.
The Google
Okay.
search AI overview will come up if you use the search box URL that's right above it. In other words, what it returned as the URL where you landed.
Yeah, just select the text with your mouse and copy and paste it.
That could work.
Okay, let me try this. Let me try the first thing. Put in the command line, paste, and hit enter. Let's see if that takes you there.
Well, let's see what happens. Why does chat not want to come up? There we are. Chat.
Or else, let me try.
Well, let me copy that.
Didn't paste it in.
And
Paste as plain text. Yeah, we'll put it in.
yeah, it worked.
No.
Okay, Peter, there you go. Guide gotten to you by Dennis, the lowest grade Linux user we got in the group.
And it's adding
And if he can
it's
do
adding
it,
a shared group.
what's your
Yeah.
excuse, Peter?
It's adding it's adding a group, and it's going to be a shared group.
And I just copied it into Chrome here on.
Yeah.
So I've got the link on my box right here.
Yeah, and it tells you just
You
exactly
can
what to
also-
do.
You can also save the chat. Everybody has the
I'm gonna-
option of saving the chat. It does not save any files, just the text. And all you do is go into chat, go up at the top, you'll see 3 little dots.
Yeah. Did that, done that, been there.
Then you got a copy of the URL without having to paste it somewhere else.
Uh,
All right. Anybody got any additional things? I think a lot of changes are going on in that, and I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to have in mind for next month right now. But I think we got to keep an eye on some of these security issues that are being brought up. We got to be understanding a little bit more about Wayland, Sway, and Hyperland, because that's going to be the future, whether we like it or not. How long Wayland continues to be used and available is anybody's guess right now.
simple note.
Right now, the developers, they want to get rid of X11 altogether, because the last, I think, if I remember correctly, I read 2014 or 2015 was the last time anything much of interest was changed in X11. That's how outdated it is. And look at all the rest of the technology changes, hardware and software, that have taken place since then. So it's something it was a good start, and it worked for quite a while, quite well, but it's gotten more and more convoluted as to how to make the smallest changes that might be needed in X11. So that's why somebody eventually created what they call Wayland. And I'm sure there were probably other packages that other people were experimenting in trying to create to replace X11 as well. Wayland seems to be the winner, and not all the wrinkles are ironed out of it by any means. Sway may add some features, and Hyperland may add features. So it gives us something to be looking forward to, and with the updates that are coming up probably in the next 4 months, we're going to have a lot of change period between the death of 10, leaving only Windows 11. You're going to have 22.2 for Mint. You're going to have LMDE 7, and God knows how many other versions of Linux are changing and upgrading their versions as well. So, depending on what you do, there's a good possibility that you're going to have a lot of activity. And I got to try and find or make some time to see if I can figure out what happened to Linux system that I usually use with that Zoom 6.5.1, because it really doesn't work. And if necessary, I'll have to purge that and then reinstall the 6.5.0, which worked better than the 0.1. All right. If unless there's somebody's got something else to bring up and discuss, maybe we ought to call it a night. And I'm gonna have to do heavy editing on this video to deal with some of the issues in the early part. Hearing nothing, then I will bid everybody an adieu.
Aloha from out here.
Good night.
Night.